Good afternoon, everyone. I am Gretchen Crosby Sims. I'm the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are so pleased to welcome former Senator Jeff Flake to campus today, and we look forward to what is undoubtedly going to be an illuminating conversation with David Axelrod. I want to just mention a couple of upcoming events. Next Tuesday, we have an all-star panel of journalists discussing the first 2 years of the Trump administration. This panel will feature Maggie Haberman, Ed Henry, Abby Phillip, and Michael Smerconish. Next Thursday, U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth will be in conversation with David at 12:15. On March 4th, we're hosting a panel discussion on how trade policies affect Illinois farmers and manufacturers. You can find out about these and all of our upcoming events at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will have questions after the moderated conversation. Please line up behind the microphone that's going to be in the center aisle. And we remind you that a question ends in a question mark. Would ask you to please make sure that your phones are on silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Andrew Piper. Andrew is a first year from Toronto studying economics. Already this year at UChicago, he's gotten involved in the Leg Up College Access Mentoring Program, the UChicago Political Union, and College Republicans. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome the Honorable Jeff Flake to the UChicago campus. Having served in the U.S. Congress for nearly 2 decades, Mr. Flake has described himself as a traditionally conservative Republican and strongly opposes the shift in rhetoric and policy under President Trump. I really hope this conversation will shed light on the current state of the GOP and its tone going into the 2020 elections. And Mr. Flake's breadth of knowledge and experience in the House of Representatives and the Senate will give you an insider's look into the GOP and the American political climate in general. Mr. Flake comes from Snowflake, Arizona, a town around 3 hours outside of Phoenix. He attended Brigham Young University, where he received a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations and a Master's of Arts in Political Science. Mr. Flake was elected to the House of Representatives in 2000 and served 6 terms, representing the East Valley region in Arizona. During this time, he was a member of the Appropriations Committee. He was elected to the Senate to represent Arizona in 2012 and was a member of the Energy and Natural Resources, Foreign Relations, and Judiciary Committees. During his time in office, he championed fiscal conservatism and openly challenged President Trump. His book, Conscience of a Conservative, A Rejection of Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle, was released in 2017. Mr. Flake did not seek re-election in the 2018 midterm elections and has joined CBS News as a political contributor. The moderator for tonight, David Axelrod, was the chief strategist for President Obama's campaigns and was afterwards appointed the advisor to the president. You are probably very familiar with his involvement with the IOP, so without further ado, David Axelrod and the Honorable Jeff Flake.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Welcome, Senator. You have the healthy pallor of a ex-senator here. And it reminds me that...
You can't even fly through Arizona without getting a tan. So, I mean, that's the...
I know, and to get someone to fly from Arizona to Chicago this time of year is a great thing. So we appreciate you being here. I think we took the wrong seat. So it says, welcome to today's event. Watch this space for messages. So if you see any messages for me, let me know.
That's okay. I'll do.
Okay. Let's start with the news of the day. The president's announced that he was going to sign an emergency order, or signed an emergency order to build the wall. And I was wondering how you processed that information. You were there at the beginning of this saga, right. At the beginning of the first shutdown. How did you process this, both as policy and as politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of policy, the interesting thing is that when you come from a border state like Arizona, you tend to spend time near the border and have maybe a little different understanding than some who are further away. To the extent that you need walls along the border, what we've had in the past are these old landing strips from Vietnam War era. We had a lot of extra ones, so we put them in cement and put them up, and it was a proper wall that you couldn't see through. It was quite opaque. we've been taking those down for years now and replacing them with fences because they work better in the urban areas or anywhere. So this need to have a big, strong wall, like the president described it, certainly during the campaign and on and off throughout his presidency. If you're from Arizona or close to the border, you kind of scratch your head and say, no, obviously we need barriers. We're on a schedule now to replace old barriers with new barriers and to extend some of the other ones, but this need for a wall, as the president describes it, just on the policy side, it never made sense.
What about the way he describes the emergency?
Right. No, we have historical low, numbers coming across the border, particularly from Mexico. We have a net migration south of Mexican nationals, largely because of improved economy in Mexico, largely because of trade agreements like NAFTA. They have benefited, we have benefited, and there's historically low turnout. And I've been in Congress for 18 years, and boy, during the period 2002 through 5, when the economy was really humming up here, man, we were having a lot more crossings. Now that the nature of it's changed, it's more from the so-called Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and it's more family units coming across. And
looking for asylum.
Yes, and that presents different challenges, but none of which are really solved by the physical barrier. We need policies that are different, and we tried to do a lot of that, and I think went a long way to solving some of those problems in the big the bipartisan immigration bill that we passed.
You passed a bill, you were part of the so-called Gang of Eight,
right.
4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. In 2013, you negotiated a immigration reform bill. It passed the Senate overwhelmingly, so with 68 votes.
Yeah.
Never got a vote in the House of Representatives. And, I mean, this is the dilemma of Jeff Flake. You did the hard work. You did it on a bipartisan basis. You tried to solve the problem. And even before your tangling with Donald Trump, that created problems for you within the Republican Party in your state.
It did. And in Arizona, like I said, there's a little different understanding of immigration. But I was always, if you're pushing for, more robust guest worker plans and some rational treatment of those who are here illegally now, the 11 million population, whether you call it an amnesty or what, that's problematic sometimes in Republican circles. But it was what was needed, and I think that framework in the Gang of Eight bill will be the framework for whatever successful comprehensive immigration reform.
And do you think there will be successful comprehensive immigration reform?
There has to be. The problem just grows in terms of those who are illegally here now. Even though there's historically low people crossing the border, nearly half of those who are here are overstays. People just overstayed a visa who crossed legally, usually flying here, and then just haven't gone home. And so you have. And you still have the dreamers, the DACA population you've got to deal with. We also need to welcome those who have high skills in the STEM fields. I had introduced long before the Gang of Eight bill something called the Staple Act, where you staple a green card to the diploma of anybody who gets a diploma in a U.S. university and an advanced degree in the STEM fields. We ought to be rolling out the red carpet and saying, stay here, bring jobs here, keep jobs here. And then on the lower skill side, we're obviously going to need help in the agricultural areas and some of the hospitality industry. We just need to remedy all of that still. So it will take place. I just think we're further away from that now than we were maybe even 18 years ago.
I mean, what you describe is sort of antithetical to the politics of the president, who really got elected on an anti-immigration platform.
Yeah, and I think that you can do that by and by through an election cycle here or there. A good example is in 1994 in California. Pete Wilson wanted a second term. He needed to excite the Republican base and independents and others. And there was Prop 187 at that time,
Right.
which was, you know, trying to restrict benefits to illegal aliens. But it did gin up the base. They came out and voted. He got a second term. And other than Arnold Schwarzenegger, no Republican official has been elected statewide since.
Right.
It excited people for the moment, but it turned off the broader population ever since. And it'll be a generation, I think, before a Republican was elected in California again. We don't even have Republicans in Congress representing Orange County now, which is remarkable. So I'm not discounting the fact that you can rile up the base for a time or two. But the politics of populism is just not a governing philosophy, and it just doesn't last very long. And in the end, you end up playing a game of subtraction rather than addition.
On the emergency order itself, you're someone who's spoken a lot about institutions, norms, rules, and laws. What's your reaction to the invocation of an emergency order for something that you've already described as not being an emergency?
It certainly can't be described as an emergency. The president's language today, when he talked about it, he said, well, we're building the wall. I just wanted to do it faster. And to try to describe that as an emergency is going to be difficult. But I would think that, you know, having been in the Senate, you know, anywhere in the Congress, in the House or the Senate, but particularly the Senate, there is usually a stronger sense of institutional prerogative. You know, we appropriate money.
Because the Constitution gives you the express function of appropriating.
That's right,
money.
and just institutional pride, if nothing else. So it's very difficult for me to see some of my colleagues just kind of acquiesce there and say, you know, let's let the president have this. If it means, you know, keeping the government open, let's indulge him in this little exercise. Boy, and some Republicans have pointed out the problem of precedent for the future. And that certainly is a problem for Republicans or conservatives. You know, if you know, a Democratic president in the future said, hey, climate change, we're going to impose this or that as an emergency, that will trouble a lot of conservatives. But the biggest reason is, you know, put aside precedent. It's the wrong thing now. And to say to a president, whether he's in your party or the other party, go ahead and take our authority. Now, we have been ceding authority to the executive branch for generations. That it kind of just the power of the presidency gets that. What is bothersome is when we willingly in the Congress, and particularly the Senate, just gives it up. And we've done that on other issues as well. Tim Kaine and I have been trying for years, you know, started during the Obama presidency, of working with the White House and others to do an AUMF, authorization for use of military force. That's
Still,
and we've
still operating on the one that was passed in
We are.
2002 for Afghanistan.
That's right, and it doesn't fit well. It's outdated. It really gives the president authority to do whatever he wants, and increasingly Congress is willing to do that simply because that's a tough decision to make, whether to engage militarily. We'd rather just let the president do it and then blame him afterwards. Mm-hmm. And so it's a dodge in a way, but we're seeing that on a number of these issues, and it's really unfortunate because the Congress is just, you know, willingly giving up a lot of its authority that it's going to be tough to wrestle back.
In that regard, because you remember when President Obama said there was a red line about chemical weapons, and then he went to Congress and wanted to be authorized, and there was very little support for it. Right. But after the fact, a lot of criticism that he didn't impose the red line.
That's a
enforce
perfect
the red
example.
line.
That's a perfect. I remember those debates in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We did, in the committee at least, grant that authority, but it was never went through. But maybe more apropos to this one is when President Obama said, you know, Congress isn't dealing with the DACA issue, and so, or the Dreamer issue, so I'm going to do DACA. every Republican on Capitol Hill said that's an overreach. And I do think it was. That was a case where the Congress simply had not acted. In this case, with the barriers or wall on the border, this is where expressly the Congress has said, no, we don't want that. And still too many Republicans are silent on the president taking
So
authority.
let me just posit this, that your colleagues who are still there, who I'm sure many of whom privately agree with you, also like being there, and they say, I want to be another Jeff Flake.
Thanks, David.
But you know what I mean.
No, I know exactly what you mean, and yeah, and it is a motivation to win a Republican primary in Arizona right now. If you are not for some of the statewide offices that state mine inspector, you might be able to get away with just not saying anything, but in the position as a senator or governor or whatever, unless you're willing to support the president, it's really tough.
But here's the irony of it. I mean, I don't know what the final statistic was, but you did support the president like 96% of the time.
No.
It was high though.
Now you're overdoing it.
But you were up there. You were up there.
I'm a conservative, and one thing that's interesting that people will. I've always found that argument interesting. People will say, well, you voted with the president on Obamacare, the repeal. Some of us had voted to repeal Obamacare, I think, 38 times before President Trump took office. But then when you vote the same way after he becomes president, you're voting with the president. And then even votes like on criminal justice reform. Is that a vote with the president? Or is it a vote that should happen? How do you count that? Or on a federal judge that was blue-slipped, or the nomination was helped by 2 Democrats in a state like New York. If you vote for that judge, is that a vote with the president or with Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand? I mean, so those rankings don't mean as much. But I am a conservative, and I like conservative policy.
Do you think he's a conservative?
No, not in the traditional sense. I'm fearing that conservatism is becoming defined as whether you support the president or not. And that was the interesting thing during this past race when we were polling, when I was still thinking of running for re-election, on the issues, fiscal responsibility, free trade, these kind of issues that have defined and animated the party for decades. That wasn't important to people. The question that was important is, are you with the president? That became a proxy for conservatism. And that's trouble for the party moving ahead. Because if you look at the policies that the president has, what has animated the party for generations is limited government. Where are we on limited government? We just hit $22 trillion. Deficits are growing faster than they did under the last 2 presidents. We're up to $1 trillion deficits again. Free trade has always been, a pillar of the Republican Party. The Republican Party has supplied 80% of the votes for trade promotion authority or ultimate trade deals traditionally in the past. And I should say that in this last election, both major party candidates, the last 4 were against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that was something that was bipartisan, but Republicans have always stood for free trade. And then immigration. That's been a little problematic for the Republican Party, but still, when you look back to Reagan at least, it was certainly, we value immigrants and their contribution and their place in the American
Well, he
society.
signed an immigration law that the far right decried as amnesty.
Right, but it was still supported by most in the party. And then certainly on other issues, on the fiscal side and trade and just basic decency. I mean, he's moved so far away from what have seen among the last several Republican presidents, Reagan and George H.W. Bush and George Bush.
How do you decide where to use your leverage? And I'll give you an example. I mean, the tax bill. By the way, you mentioned deficits. That was one of the concerns that people raised about a $1.5 trillion tax bill, that you're going to create larger deficits, and that's turned out to be true. But and I think it was on that bill, wasn't it, that you held out until the end for some consideration on some provisions you wanted in the tax bill, but also for a serious discussion of DACA.
Yeah, there were some provisions on the tax code, and I think if it would have been my bill, I would have lowered the corporate rate like we did, maybe not as much, maybe to 25, and not done an individual rate cut at all. Now, that's not at all what the Democratic side of the aisle wanted. But that, I mean, if you're a supply side, or if you believe there are stimulative properties to some tax cuts, it's there on the corporate side, but not by lowering the individual rate from 39.5 to 37. You just don't get any stimulative benefits. All you have is deficit problems. But still, I think our problem, I think if you look over time, we desperately needed corporate tax reform. We have to be competitive globally. And I thought that the pluses outweighed the minuses. But I did hold out on DACA. I wanted a vote on DACA. And I was promised that by Mitch McConnell and by the end of January, and we got it on February 8th. So a week late, but we got it. We just didn't win it. And so you use leverage in the Senate. In the House, the rules protect the majority. If you have the majority, you can do just about anything. In the Senate, the rules protect the individual, and you have a lot more leverage, particularly if there's a tight margin. And I tried to use that along the way where I could, holding up judges, for example, to get at least a show vote on tariffs, to show the president at least that the Republicans aren't with him on this issue. And then later, the last 2 months I was in, I held up more than 50 judges to just try to get my own leadership to schedule a vote on protecting the special counsel. And I felt that that was a good use of leverage that I had.
Do you think you used it to the maximum that you could?
Because
I understand that you're voting on some bills that you agree with.
Yeah.
I mean, but when you were there were 51 Republicans. That seems like a position of enormous influence.
Oftentimes we didn't have it. There was a Democrat or two who would come across. So you have to really look and see where you have leverage. Where I did have leverage and used it a few times, and not just times that were made public, but where the president floated names for judgeships, and knowing that we only had a one-person margin on the Judiciary Committee, all it took is one of us, and often me, saying no. But often that never became public. But where it did become public, there were a few that judges. One of the things that a president does, Republican or Democrat, and my feeling has always been, unless there's some disqualifying element, you give the president his people or her people. And that's why I voted with President Obama almost all the time on his nominees. I voted for Loretta Lynch. I didn't agree much with her on philosophy, but elections have consequences, and there was nothing. She was certainly qualified for the job.
How did you feel about Merrick Garland?
I actually met with I met with Merrick Garland. Most of my colleagues didn't. This was little known, but near the last 2 months, I was trying to get a vote scheduled for him, and I was in discussions with President Obama and others during the lame duck session, which we all thought would be after a Hillary Clinton victory, that at least we could get him moved through in a lame duck session. So I have a lot of respect for Merrick Garland.
What did you think about that precedent?
It was not unprecedented. I mean, if you technically look back, you'd have to look back to 1888 to find an example of when a president of one party pushed through somebody when the Senate was controlled by the other party. So it wasn't unprecedented.
You mean in the final year of his term? Or?
I don't even know if that is a distinction. But so it wasn't unprecedented as some people thought it was. But I didn't think it was. I wish we wouldn't have done that because it just exacerbated a problem that's been growing and getting worse for years. Prior to 2003, there was only one example of, and it wasn't even a similar example. Abe Fortas wasn't elevated on the Supreme Court, but nobody ever used a filibuster to block any part of the president's executive calendar, including judges or cabinet picks. And now, after 2003, routinely, Democrats did it early on, Republicans did it to a greater extent, and it's been like this ever since, and it's just not a good thing.
You got quite a bit of attention during your final months there relative to Justice Kavanaugh, who was then Judge Kavanaugh. Talk a little bit about your thought processes. And everybody saw this very dramatic scene in which you were you were in the elevator and these two women confronted you and so on, and you looked very anguished about it. Talk about that whole process of how you decided to hold up the nomination for a week and why you decided ultimately to move forward on it.
I take the stairs a lot more now for a number of reasons.
That's why you look so fit.
But right prior to that happening, I had announced that I would vote to send his nomination to the full Senate, that I would vote in committee to do that. But I was very at unease on my decision because I never accepted my leadership's insistence that we couldn't do an FBI investigation. I first insisted that Dr. Ford be allowed to testify and that I wouldn't vote to advance him out of committee unless she was brought forward to testify.
What did you think of her testimony?
I thought it was compelling. I thought it was. But then I thought his was as well. I thought he acted like somebody who felt that he was unjustly accused. I think that's where the country was. Anybody who expresses such certainty that they know who was telling the complete truth, I just never had that certainty. Still don't.
But if there's ambiguity, should you advance them on the Supreme Court?
Well, you can look at it that way, but then you look at it this way: should you allow an uncorroborated allegation in itself to be something that would disqualify somebody? That alone. Do we want to set that standard? That's the flip side. Now, somebody could make a good argument that regardless of whether or not you believe those allegations as she expressed them, his behavior should have been enough, in the committee. And I thought that, his questioning or answers to questions of Amy Klobuchar and some of the answers he gave, I thought that wasn't a good example of what a judge should be. But if you weigh that against his time as a federal judge, on the D.C. Circuit for 10 years, you could not get one of his colleagues, including Merrick Garland or any of the plaintiffs or clerks, anybody who dealt with him, to say one contrary thing about his time on the D.C. Circuit. And in the end, I felt strongly that we ought to have the FBI investigation, and I would never want FBI investigations to become public, because you would deter a lot of people from submitting their name for nomination if you did. But I wish the country could have read that report. I think that they would feel better about where the Senate landed in the end. But I thought that as far back to the protesters in the elevator, the president came out and said, "Oh, they're paid protesters," and really ridiculed them, as did a lot of people on my side of the aisle.
And he ridiculed Dr. Ford.
He did. And I think that's awful to do that. You just don't do that. But the people who confronted me in the elevator, what they were saying, I had been hearing throughout the week before, or throughout a couple of weeks before, from friends, from family members. This struck a chord. Whether or not you believe her claims as she expressed them or his rebuttal, that struck a chord, especially with women across the country, and I felt that, and it did have an influence on me in calling for and insisting on the FBI investigation.
How much heat did you take during that period?
You have no idea. It's interesting. On the question more broadly of what's wrong with politics today, all of the incentives are to rush to the fringes, to rush to your corner, to get to your tribe and stay there, and never indicate for a nanosecond that you might be influenced by a hearing that you are chairing or participating in, or an investigation that might be occurring, because as soon as you do, then you're hit from both sides. And that is not a comfortable position to be in. It really isn't. And nobody wants to be in that position, whether you're up for re-election or not. It's just given the media culture and Twitter and everything else, it's not where you want to be. And people ask, how's retirement? I say, my wife said the other day, we've gone a month with no death threats. Because
you said there were some relative to the Kavanaugh hearing.
You bet, from the right and from the left. There's somebody, I think, in jail here in Chicago, or convicted here in Chicago, of making a threat to my family in Arizona.
You also were on that ball field when the Republican members were attacked.
Yeah, and just before that, on the pipe bomber who sent the pipe bombs to CNN and a lot of people, when he was caught, Capitol Police called and said, you're all over his hard drives. And then we found out he had a couple of Twitter handles, and on one of them he had done an aerial photo of my home in Arizona with the caption, Jeff, there are a lot of entrances. I'll see you soon. And so, I mean, that was just one of many. I mean, texts that my wife received with beheading videos, with the addresses of all of our kids. That's where politics has gone. And then the ball field, in June of
Let me just say 17. Parenthetically, part of our mission is to inspire people to consider careers in private life. So you're not helping me here.
I'm hoping that people will bring a change to that, because I can tell you it is driving some people who would run for office away, and it shouldn't. But the ball field, that morning, I was standing between home plate and first base, and a shot rang out, and we just kind of looked at each other. That sounded like gunfire, but just one shot. And then seconds later, the volley came, and somebody yelled, "Shooter, shooter!" And I just remember the one memory that just sticks with me was turning to run to the dugout, first base dugout, because it was the only cover there was, and seeing the bullets pitch off the gravel right in front of me, and just thinking, why us? Why, how can somebody look at a bunch of middle-aged men playing baseball and see the enemy? It was just, but then the next 10 minutes was, huddling in the dugout, using another congressman's belt to put a tourniquet on one of the staff members who'd been shot in the leg, and then rushing out to Steve Scalise and plugging up the hole with my batting glove in his hip to, while we waited for first responders. It was nothing I ever want to go through again. But the shooter was killed at the scene, and he had a list of Republicans that he was after.
Yeah.
And we've got to get away from this, but you've got to have leadership that does that and that doesn't exacerbate the situation.
Who are you referring to?
This problem is before the president came along.
No, you're right. You talked earlier about the incentives to, and there are people who make a lot of money riling up folks as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't note that that was a horrific experience you went through. That is a common experience for people who live probably a mile from here. We have a horrendous gun violence problem in Chicago, and you know, you have a very strong position on gun legislation. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, do you, in the context of the easy access to weapons that we live with here in Chicago?
Well, I differ from some of my Republican colleagues on that. I'm sponsored with Dianne Feinstein, the no fly, no buy. I do think that there are things that we should do, and I think my party ought to be more responsive to the issue.
So if you're on a no-fly list because you have suspected,
right,
you couldn't buy a gun.
Yeah, and also some other measure, obviously the bump stock thing. I sponsored something with Martin Heinrich on that issue. There are things that we can and should do to
what about like this? What about universal background check?
Yes, I do think we ought to have that, but there is one issue I had with Toomey Mansion. I grew up in Snowflake, Arizona, a small rural town. I grew up on a cattle ranch, and as I saw it, that legislation, unless it was amended, and I had some amendments to it that we just couldn't get, but you don't want to make criminal action lending a gun to a cousin or posting on Facebook and having a family member, extended family member, buy it and not report that and go through everything. You've got to recognize, you know, differing situations in rural areas and whatnot. But there are things that we can do that would have. I'm a fan of background checks. I'm a big fan of them. There are ways that we ought to be able to do that and still not make criminals out of people in rural areas who have more of a culture of hunting.
What are the political ramifications for Republicans and people in rural areas who tend mostly to be Republicans these days for supporting any kind of gun legislation?
Oh, that's the NRA's position is, you know, it's a slippery slope.
Nose under
so,
the
yeah, you just don't give on anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, you know, something like the bump stock thing was so easy for Congress to do it. But then they, you know, go to the administration, no, you do it, because if Congress does it, then Congress will get the appetite to go a little further on some other issues. And I frankly think that that we need to take some action that we haven't. Certainly, the mental health issue is something that there ought to be agreement and better legislation than we have right now related to guns.
I just want to touch briefly on foreign policy. As you mentioned, you were on the Foreign Relations Committee, and there are some issues on which you led that were kind of iconoclastic. One was Cuba, in which you were an advocate for the liberalization of our relationship. Why did you take that position, and what do you think of the administration's policy? Where will that lead?
Well, I started on that issue when I first got to Congress in 2001. I just always thought, as a Republican, Republicans preach the gospel of engagement and contact and commerce and trade, and that we can nudge countries toward democracy through those means. But with Cuba, Republicans would say, no, we've got to isolate them, and that works. And I just thought it was inconsistent with our foreign policy.
Well, you had like a half a century of evidence.
Yeah, exactly. I always thought, if you want to get rid of the Castro brothers, make them deal with spring break just once or twice. You know, just I think they'd wave the white flag and say that's enough. But I always thought that as a Republican and conservative, we ought to allow Americans to go see what socialism looks like. We've got a museum 90 miles from our shore, pure socialism, and it's not a pretty picture. And it's a sobering thing. Instead, we just let, you know, a few movie stars go down there and they come back, you know, Fidel Castro's a smart guy and whatever. And let Joe from Peoria go down and he'd have a different feeling coming back. And then also you by allowing Americans to travel, you help create an entrepreneurial class in Cuba, those running bed and breakfasts and private restaurants. And
We took a group from the Institute of Politics there.
exactly. And so I was able to pass legislation in 2001, 2001 through 4 to lift the travel ban. I just couldn't get President Bush to sign it. By the time President Obama came in, I couldn't pass it anymore. He would have signed it. But gratefully, he did what he could, by executive authority that was, unquestioned, to allow Cuban American travel unfettered. Before Cuban Americans, this is how bad it was. And I spoke to somebody yesterday, last night at a speech, who had this problem with her family. If your mother or father were still in Cuba, and you were a Cuban American in Florida or elsewhere, back from 2000 to 2008 or so, if your mother died, you'd have to decide, do I go to her funeral? Because if my father dies within 3 years, I can't go to his. There were Cuban Americans only allowed to go once every 3 years. And it was pretty strictly enforced. And it was just awful policy. So gratefully, President Obama lifted restrictions on Cuban American travel. That, in turn, and on remittances, has created an entrepreneurial class. 1 in 4 Cubans now works outside of the state sector, and they do a lot better. And we had the first example just a couple of months ago where the Cuban government tried to impose additional restrictions on private business in Cuba, and the entrepreneurial class rose up there and said, no, you can't do that. And they were dissuaded from doing that, which is really quite remarkable. And so I've thought that, and when people ask what was your most memorable moment in Congress in 18 years, undoubtedly it was, I'd been down to visit Alan Gross, an American AID contractor who had been imprisoned by the Cubans, convicted of being a spy. And we couldn't move further with policy changes until he was released. It was a real problem. Ben Rhodes and others were really working hard in the White House, Susan Rice, and I was working with them. But I'd been to visit Alan Gross in prison in Havana in November of 14, and he was about to commit suicide. And I went to Susan Rice and others, said, if you're not negotiating for his release, you better be. And they were. And a couple weeks later, I got a call saying, would you be at Andrews Air Force Base at 5 a.m. on Wednesday? This was a Monday. But don't tell your wife or your staff where you're going. And so Pat Leahy and I got to Andrews, and we engaged. And there was Judy Gross, Alan's wife, there at the airport. We got on one of the president's planes and flew down to do the old Cold War era spy swap, prisoner swap. 3 planes, spies, convicted Cuban spies in Miami, and then we landed, and 30 minutes later we were in the air. And I'll never forget, the best moment is we, about a half hour into the flight, the pilot came on and said, we've now entered U.S. airspace. And Alan Gross just stood up and just pumped his fist in the air, and then just breathed in and out several times and said, now I know I'm free. And it was just, if you ever needed more affirmation that this is the greatest country in the world, that was it.
The microphone's set up here. Please line up if you have questions. Just before, while they do that.
Oh no, they're eager. Oh, yeah. Please keep going, David.
The president withdrew from the Iran nuclear treaty. I think you opposed that.
I did. I was more sympathetic to the. I just thought it could have been negotiated better, and it should have been negotiated as a treaty. And frankly, I think had President Obama from the beginning said, we want to negotiate a treaty, and gotten buy-in.
To go through Congress.
Yes, and he would have gotten buy-in, I think, enough.
What about the decision to withdraw from the policy?
I did not agree with the decision to withdraw. I mean, once you're into it, and once Iran had already realized a lot of the benefits that couldn't be undone in terms of the money that was released, not given to them, as our president keeps saying, but the release of money, then, boy, if you can have them stick to the agreement, you do so.
Which they were.
Yes, and are.
And are
so far.
sticking to the agreement.
And so I didn't agree with the decision to go away from it.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Thomas. I'm a first year at the Public Policy School. I followed your decision not to run for re-election this past year. And I guess, as somebody who's always had conservative values, your decision was disheartening in the sense that it kind of seemed like you were resigning yourself or giving up on your ability to articulate conservative values in a compelling way that would win an election, I guess. So is that the case? Have you given up on American people's ability to, be attracted to those values? And if that's not the case, then why won't you run in 2020?
Oh boy, why did we go to questions? We're doing okay here. And I'm asked that often. Why didn't you just fight it out? And if you believe in these principles, stick to them. When you run a campaign, it is all-consuming. It consumes your family and everything else. And if you don't believe that you're going to win that campaign, one, to put your family through it. Two, to try to get motivated volunteers and donors and others when you're saying, I'm not going to win, I'm just going to make a point. That's just tough to do. And to the bottom line for me in the end, I knew, given my read of the electorate in Arizona, is that I would have to adopt some of the policies that the president has adopted that I simply could not, and condone behavior that I could never condone. And in the end, I knew that I would have to stand on a campaign stage with the president when people were shouting, "Lock her up," and things like that, and I just couldn't. So that was the bottom line.
What about the Thomas's question was about the presidential race, though? Shouldn't
Oh, that's the easier one. Is that the case?
Shouldn't somebody stand up for your vision of what conservatism is?
I do hope that somebody runs, if nothing else, to remind Republicans what conservatism really is, what has traditionally been, and what it will need to be if we're going to be a relevant party in the future. I do hope that somebody does, but I've been doing this for 18 years, and my family has been quite forgiving, and I think a little breather here is good. And I do think that if the president decides that he wants the nomination, again, he'll get it. I think he won't win the general. I don't think that he should. But right now, if you look at Republican primary voters, they are a subset of a subset, and they are with him strongly in Arizona and elsewhere in terms of winning the nomination. So, if somebody was going out there, to run against the president, I think good points can be made. But in terms of defeating the president, now he may decide that he's made America great in 4 years and it doesn't need a second term, and that then the equation changes for a lot of Republicans who might run. But if he wants the nomination, I don't see how that subset of a subset will look at somebody else.
Yes.
Senator, thank you very much for joining us. My name's Ronan. I'm a third year here in the college. And what I'm wondering is how someone such as yourself, who identifies as conservative, argues we should address the problem of climate change.
Oh, great. Well, I think that we Republicans are missing the boat by, and not the whole party, but a big chunk of the party is dismissing climate change. The president's called it a hoax. It's not. I believe the science. I think that the best way to go about it, the most reasonable way, rational way, is through a carbon tax, a revenue-neutral carbon tax. That was the last bill I introduced in the Senate, along with Chris Coons. And for those who said, well, you're just doing it on the way out, I introduced that similar bill 8 years ago in the House. So I've believed for a long time that the better than cap and trade, that can be gamed a lot of ways and it's too complex and complicated. A carbon tax where you recognize the negative externalities there and government has to step in is the best way to secure long-term investment in renewables or other energy sources that we need to do. So that's where I would like to see Republicans spend their time. And there are a lot of good groups. I mean, Republican notables like George Shultz and Baker and others have come out in favor of that policy.
Anyone under 80?
There are some, and some of the groups out there. I mean, even ExxonMobil has come out in favor of a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way to do it. You simply say, you know, we need to deal with the negative externalities, but we don't want to hit to the economy, and we don't want to negatively impact a certain segment. So I think that's the best way.
Hi, my name is Adam. I'm a second year in the college from Iowa City. My question is also about climate change. I was wondering, as a Republican who believes in the science behind climate change, if you could comment on why you think the party has been so slow on the issue.
Well, I mean, that one's an easy one to just point at the other side and say, hey, they're way out there. And believe me, the Democrats made it a lot easier for Republicans to do when certain Democrats are supporting something that seems so pie in the sky, the green agenda. That's a gift politically to Republicans. And so it like I was saying before, the trend has been you rush to your corner, you adopt a position, you don't show any willingness to change or evolve or reconsider your position. That's the kind of the safe place to be. And I would say that problem is more pronounced on my side, but it's kind of on both sides as well. On the Democratic side, you have, I think, on the climate change issue, you know, you've got to have baseload power, and carbon-free baseload is nuclear. But you have a hard time getting some Democrats to say, hey, that's got to be part of the mix, or GMOs, or, you know, if you're going to believe the science, really believe the science. So I don't know why, what it's going to take to move others. I think it's mostly that millennials are engaged on this topic, and ultimately, as you know, elections go on, the Republican Party will adapt there, but I think it needs to sooner.
Yeah, ultimately, under the circumstances, is not a very satisfying concept.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
But I do think that by putting out something that just can be so easily ridiculed and painted as pie-in-the-sky crazy stuff, it makes it easier for Republicans to just sit back and do nothing rather than meet somebody halfway on something.
Hello, Senator Flake. Thanks for the time today. My name's Andrew. I'm a second year here at the business school. My question is about immigration reform. In this debate, it seems like there are a lot of trade-offs that make sense and complement each other. Things like a Dreamer and a restoration of temporary protected status for the wall, and mandatory E-Verify in exchange for a path to permanent residency for people who are already here. You've already mentioned that the president has a base that seems willing to follow him anywhere. So given those circumstances, why can't we make deals around this issue more than sort of, you know, fussing around the edges? And what can we do to fix this problem?
Great. Well, we had some of those deals actually negotiated and worked out a year ago exactly. And many of us went to the White House and were there around that table when the president said, hey, yeah, you guys are the experts on this. You pass something, I'll sign it. That was the 10 o'clock president. The 2 o'clock president said something completely different. And so that's the difficulty that
so you just have to move faster.
I guess so. That's that. But yeah, that's been difficult for Republicans to negotiate. Usually it's just, you know, negotiating with the other side. But in this case, we just never knew where the president was. And certain staff members of the president have push him one way, and others are pulling him the other way, and he can change his mind at any minute. So I always thought that we could get with this president, when he started out, the art of the deal, and I negotiate, that we could get some kind of trade-off like that. And I've been on board with a number of them, the Bridge Act, you name it, but we haven't been able to do it. It used to be, when I was in the House, that the DREAM Act, which is dealing with the DACA kids, that was the easy part. You had a good number of Republicans, certainly more support on the Democratic side. Dick Durbin has been one that's really pushed this hard. But enough Republicans to pass that on its own, but we always said, let's hold that and combine it with some other things. And so that was kind of used as bait to get some of the more difficult things passed. Now, we can't even pass that on its own. And that's how much more difficult the immigration
This underscore a problem, though, because he does agree to things, and then he gets reverb from the base, and he pulls back. This happened on gun control. It happened on this DACA issue.
Yeah, it did.
It happened on, frankly, the shutdown.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Hi, Senator. I'm Michael. I'm a first year in the college. So you mentioned during your discussion of Merrick Garland that you didn't like how the Supreme Court confirmation process has become overly partisan. So I was wondering, with regards to when Judge Kavanaugh gave a largely partisan statement during his second hearing with a lot of unsubstantiated allegations about his nomination being sidetracked due to pent-up anger about Trump's election and revenge from the Clintons, if his very partisan statement affected your opinion of his fitness for confirmation to a supposedly nonpartisan court.
Well, that's a great question. I mentioned, aside from the allegations or the validity of them, that was the reason that some gave. I've talked to a couple of Democrats who may have been more inclined to vote for him, or the centrist Democrats, who that was the turning point for them. And I do respect that, and I didn't like the way he performed there. But you also have to put that in terms of, if you felt that you were unjustly accused, might you act a little defensive and irrational, and then you also consider against that what his record has been. And if there was any hint in his record that he exhibited those tendencies, partisan tendencies, while he was on the D.C. Circuit Court, where you have plenty of opportunity to do so. That's a tough court. A lot of tough opinions come through there. But he didn't. He was the model of decorum and decency for 10 years on the court. And so I think a lot of us, and I certainly did, you weigh those factors as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Senator. It's great for you to be here today. My question is that with both Congress and the country as a whole becoming more partisan and divided, and Arizona having recently elected a senator from the Democratic Party and a senator from the Republican Party, do you have any advice for both Senators Sinema and McSally for the future as a whole?
Yes, a lot of advice. Well, I don't think that Republicans have fully come to terms with what a shellacking we took in the midterm elections. The way the map was, we just couldn't lose the Senate. It was just too tough. When you only have 8 seats you're defending, and Democrats have, 25?
26, yeah.
It's just, it's impossible. And I mean, when you don't have any Republicans left, as I mentioned, in Orange County, and people tend to look at Congress, but you look at state legislatures. I mean, it was a complete wipeout in states like Nevada and New Mexico. Every statewide office went. So I have a lot of advice for Republicans. I don't know that they'll take my advice. The Democrats probably certainly won't. But in terms of Arizona and the 2 senators, I think Kyrsten Sinema, her record in the House was a very moderate senator and willing to work with the other side. And so far in the Senate, she just voted for the Attorney General to confirmation. She seems to be following that model. If she does, I don't think she'll have a problem being reelected in Arizona. Martha McSally is in a very difficult position. She ended up losing by a full 2 percentage points, 60,000 votes. It's not close. And so I think that she's going to have to exhibit some independence because if she runs the same kind of race that she did, I don't think she should expect a different outcome. In Arizona, those who, in an office that people pay attention to, if those people appeared on the campaign stage with the president or seen as supportive of the president and his agenda, those Republicans lost statewide, and those who kept a respectable distance and ran more as traditional conservatives were okay. Arizona still has a 200,000 person voter registration advantage. So my advice to Republicans would be exhibit some independence, but that's very difficult because you've got to get through a primary.
Yeah, you got to run a primary.
And I could not have won a Republican primary, not at all. Had I kept the same position, I could have, if I would have said as soon as the president was elected, well, I've changed my mind on his policies and I'm okay with that behavior. I could have then, but I
could have gone all Lindsey Graham.
But
so did you ever consider?
He said that, I didn't.
Did you ever consider running as an independent?
Thought so. I don't think we're there yet. Certain states have more of a tradition of that. I think we'll get there. I hope we do, because something's got to break this tribalism, and you've got to have I mean, you could have all you need is, 8 or 10 in the Senate who to create a whole new power center. And you could have a prominent Republican or Democrat who can get like-minded people around, and they could change the nature of the Senate completely and break up this polarization. But I don't think we're there yet in Arizona as far as an independent. And I know Mike Bloomberg nationally. He has a lot of money to study this 6 ways to Sunday,
yes,
and he's concluded that it's just not there yet.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming. My name's Colin. I'm a second year at the business school as well. Kind of building on that is the right kind of does what they need to do to get reelected, and the left kind of goes off the socialism edge. Are there any people or policies that could actually be put in place to bring people back into the middle? Obviously, third party or independent, it doesn't sound like an option, but.
All of the incentives, like I said, are to push you apart, and it's only when the voters value people that govern will I think we have a change. And I mean, there's some institutional things that have made bipartisanship more difficult. There's the old discussion about members used to move their families back to Washington when they were elected. That is true. Mo Udall, he was a congressman in Arizona. He wrote a book called The Job of a Congressman. I read it a while ago, and he said in there, we have enough money in our office budget to fly home to Arizona 3 times a year. The rest of the time, he and his family, other Republican families, Democratic families, lived in the same neighborhoods. Their kids played on the same sports teams. Mm-hmm. They worshiped together on the weekends. And the friendships that they, built overwhelmed the partisanship during the weekdays. And you just don't have that with a commuter Congress. Now virtually everybody comes in on a Monday night or a Tuesday night and leaves on a Thursday night. And you just don't have the socialization. I got so frustrated with it when I got to the Senate that I decided to take Martin Heinrich, who was elected the same time, a Democrat from New Mexico, to maroon ourselves on a deserted island in the Pacific, just to show that Republicans and Democrats could get along. I'm not kidding, we did that. we Discovery Channel filmed it. It's called Rival Survival. You can get it on.
Even you're thinking reality show.
Yes, you can get it on Amazon for $3.99 still. But no, we came back. Not one of our colleagues knew that we had done this. And then the show aired, and we went on, a lot of the shows to talk about it. Stephen Colbert ran a clip of us spearing fish or whatever. He said, Flake and Heinrich proved once and for all that Republicans and Democrats can get along when death is the only option. So there are a lot of things pulling us apart, but I don't know. I mean, gerrymandering and just the whole milieu and the media, for me, when I talk to people my age, I just say, change the channel. Whatever you're watching. If you're watching Axelrod all day on CNN, change the channel.
Wait, what kind of message is that?
But if you're watching Fox all day, watch some of Axelrod. Whatever you're watching, just change the channel every once in a while. And for people your age, it's, get out of your news feed and recognize that people feel differently. Not everybody feels the same way you do. I just get a kick out of when I hear from conservatives at home, everybody I know, thinks you're all wet on this issue, or everybody I know. And
Yeah.
I have no doubt everybody they talk to or they hear from on Facebook or whatever feel that way, but people need to get out of it. And it's really making it difficult to reach the kind of bipartisan compromise. Barry Goldwater is known for, saying, extremism and defense of liberty is no vice, and, being a hardliner. But he also said at one point, politics is nothing more than public business. Sometimes you make the best of a mixed bargain. Mm. And I think that more of us now need to remember that.
One more question, and
Thanks
thank
again.
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just want to point out that Mo Udall also said, he said, what's the difference between a cactus and a caucus? He said, with a cactus, the pricks are on the outside. This was after he lost the party leadership vote there.
Well, he was one of the early Arizonans to say as well, which has been picked up by a lot of candidates since, that Arizona is the only place where mothers don't tell their children, someday you can grow up to be president. Because we've had a lot of candidates who didn't get all the way.
Including Barry Goldwater.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Senator Flake. Thanks very much. My name is Talia Weiss, and I'm a master's student in political science here. And my question actually builds on what we were just discussing, which is having to do with social media in particular and its relationship with polarization. And I was wondering if you think that the problem of the effect of social media on public discourse has changed things in a fundamental way at all, or if it's really just a continuation of a slide toward partisanship we were seeing for a while. And along those lines, I'm curious if you think there are any responses that should be taken that are targeted towards social media in particular.
On the last one, there's a lot of discussion of this, and there will be, I think, a lot in the coming years. And I'm not sure on that yet, where we need to go, but it no doubt has taken a trend that was already developing and just laid it out and exacerbated it and made it far more difficult. Just one example. I've been quite critical of the president's use of crude and vulgar language. I've tried to call him out, to have a Republican saying, no, this shouldn't be said, over the past 2 years. So when the new Congresswoman, where's she from? Who said the other day that the president ought to be impeached using quite crude and vulgar language, I tweeted something out saying, this language has no place in politics. Because the president does it, should be no excuse. Within 2 or 3 days, there were 30,000 comments on that post. And the overwhelming, I didn't read all of them, but scanning some of them, the overwhelming sentiment was, if the president speaks this way, then so must we. And that, we're entering a real crisis point if that's where our political culture has been. And that's why it is the responsibility of those elected officials, particularly in the highest positions, to model behavior that's better, more becoming. But where we go in terms of social media and what strictures we put in place, I'll be interested in that discussion going ahead.
Thanks very much.
Senator, so good to be with you. Thank you for coming. As a parting question, let me just ask you whether you see yourself back in politics again, or are the joys of private life such that you're done?
No, I posted a picture the other day of me sledding down a hill with my grandson and said, post-Senate life, so far, so good. And of course, the responses to that, yeah, you're going downhill just like you took the country. But it's, a month out, it's great. No death threats, like I said. And then also, I'm doing some work with CBS on a series called Common Ground. Common Ground may be dead in Washington, but it's alive and well everywhere else. And we're going to tell some of those stories. And that is going to be good. And But I haven't written off public office. I need a breather. But this is a wonderful country, and there are good people on both sides of the aisle in Washington doing their best. And this system is such that we've faced bigger issues in the past. You look at the Civil War, and slavery, and women's suffrage, and civil rights, and I mean we've been through and have solved many problems. So we can solve these, and the pendulums tend to swing, sometimes with a vengeance. And I hope that the things that we're talking about here don't dissuade people from running for office. We need good people who will do that and make the system better. So,
amen. Thank you.
Thank you.